Hello, I'm Simon Appell and I'm a partner and managing director in AlixPartners turnaround and restructuring practice. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to interview Mitchell Reiss as part of a session on mediation and negotiation that I was part of at Insol's conference in Hong Kong. Mitchell is a US diplomat, academic, and business leader. He served as Director of Policy Planning in the US Department of State under George W. Bush, and, perhaps most pertinent to this discussion, served as the US Special Envoy for Northern Ireland, working with British and Irish governments as part of the peace process negotiations. He was also Chief Negotiator for the nuclear disarmament program in the Korean Peninsula. Given Mitchell's extensive experience in navigating complex negotiations and fostering agreements under high-stakes geopolitical conditions, I believe this conversation is incredibly timely. The current macroeconomic climate is marked by uncertainty, with challenges ranging from global supply chain disruptions to international trade tensions and the ongoing need for cross-border collaboration to promote economic recovery efforts. Mitchell's insights into diplomacy, strategy, and conflict resolution carry valuable lessons for navigating the intricate dynamics of today's interconnected global economy. We used an extract from my interview at the Insol conference, but I believe that sharing the entire discussion can provide a broader perspective on the art of negotiation and its role in tackling contemporary economic and political challenges. My first question to Mitchell was about complexity. I explained that in our small world of restructuring and insolvency, we can convince ourselves that mediation or even negotiation is not possible given the complexities we have to manage. I asked him to explain some of the complexities that he has had to navigate in his negotiations and mediations.
I found that negotiation is always possible, even when the stakes involve issues that are diplomatically sensitive, technically complex, and financially significant. With North Korea, we had a country that was still at war with South Korea and the United States. North Korea was building both nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, and it had forward deployed 80 to 90% of its armed forces along the demilitarized zone, which placed South Korea's capital, Seoul, at great risk. When I led my very first delegation into North Korea, my South Korean colleagues were so nervous that they all wrote out their final wills before the trip. Our mission was to deliver millions of dollars of oil to North Korea each year and build 2 civilian nuclear power reactors in return for North Korea dismantling its nuclear weapons programs. This meant negotiating oil and shipping contracts with vendors around the world and importing all the nuclear technology and labor into North Korea, at a time when you couldn't even send a postcard between North and South. And of course, we had to negotiate comprehensive blanket immunity for all of our employees. We couldn't allow the North Koreans to prosecute any of our employees for any infraction, real or imagined, from jaywalking to murder. All told, I negotiated a half-dozen agreements with the North. In Northern Ireland, with the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, we were dealing with a secretive terrorist organization that we needed to persuade to abandon its goal of uniting Ireland through violence and instead support a purely political process that allowed the people in Northern Ireland to determine the issue through the ballot box. We had to make sure that the 3 governments, the US, the UK, and Ireland, were aligned on all the key issues as we proceeded. And I also had to bring along a very important domestic constituency with enormous political influence, the 30 million members of Irish America. In the end, we were successful. The IRA decommissioned its weapons, committed itself to a purely peaceful way forward, and the 2 leading parties in Northern Ireland shared political power starting in May 2007.
My next question to Mitchell was to ask how we overcame these complexities.
Crucial is setting clear goals at the start and having constant communication with the other stakeholders. My guide is always no surprises. With both North Korea and the IRA, negotiating my side of the table was often far harder than negotiating with the other party. By that, I mean that I spent far more time discussing tactics and strategy with the US, the UK, and Irish governments than actually negotiating with the IRA. And I spent far more time consulting with South Korea and Japan than I did negotiating with North Korea.
I explained to Mitchell that as restructuring professionals, we're often dealing with cross-border matters, and as part of this, the need to navigate cultural issues and communication nuances. I asked him if he could tell us about his experiences with this and how he handled them.
Negotiations are always challenging, but they're much more so if you're dealing with parties who don't speak your language, don't share your culture, or don't have your level of legal sophistication and technical expertise. That was the case in spades with North Korea. I needed to understand North Korea's history, society, and culture, including the country's founding myths and heroes. I also wanted to know the personal histories of the North Korean officials sitting across the table from me. What was their personal journey like? What motivated or deterred them? I also always wrote the first draft for our negotiations and even provided the North Koreans with technical documents and nuclear manuals so we could try to elevate their understanding of modern technology and safeguards. The IRA was not always very sophisticated either. When the IRA first met secretly with the British in the early 1970s, in the middle of a deserted field, in the dark of night, they asked the Brits to bring ID with them to prove that they were really government officials. When I asked a senior IRA official about this incident many years later, he told me, "We didn't know anything. We were just kids."
I said to Mitchell that I was struck by one of his comments in his book, Negotiating with Evil, where he said, when it comes to negotiations, amateurs talk about outcomes, professionals talk about process. I explained that as a bunch of very transactional people in the restructuring and insolvency world, we can tend to obsess about outcome. So I wanted to understand what he meant by that comment.
The starting point for any negotiation and the first rule of diplomacy is to establish a process so that a negotiation can be sustained. Otherwise, you are condemned to a series of ad hoc discussions that don't give you time to identify the key issues and can't allow you to build a foundation for resolving differences. If people in the R&I world already have a firm commitment to negotiate, then they've surmounted the first hurdle. But even then, there are a few dangers every negotiator needs to be aware of. Let me briefly describe a few. Authority. Does the person sitting across from you have the authority to make a decision, or are you really negotiating with someone back in the home office? With North Korea, I was clearly negotiating with people back in Pyongyang. With the IRA, the people sitting across from me had the authority to make decisions. Assumptions. You need to test every assumption. I told my delegation that when the other side says good morning, we need to check our watches and look out the window to make sure. Time. Whose side of the table is time on? Even if both parties want to get a deal done, which one's more eager? And how can you use time to structure the negotiation to your advantage? Leverage. Are there pressure points or leverage you can use in this negotiation? If not, can you create or generate your own leverage? For example, in Northern Ireland, I knew I could influence Gerry Adams if I could win the support of Irish America. And ego. Don't ever make a negotiation personal. Never commit your ego to a position so that it's impossible for you to back down or trade it away.
Mitchell and I then moved from the negotiation process to the role of the actual negotiator. I asked, how important is the selection of the individual or team responsible for the negotiation?
Anyone can learn to become a good negotiator, but like many things in life, some people are naturally better at negotiating than others. A first-rate negotiator should have high emotional intelligence, EQ, which means an even temperament, sound judgment, keen listening skills, and empathy. Two other qualities you want to have are someone who has the ability to explain complicated ideas clearly and someone who has the creativity to play around with the different variables, including price, the form of payment, payment schedule, risks, liabilities, and time. With respect to the negotiating team, its members should ideally have a variety of expertise attuned to the issues being negotiated financial, legal, tax, or whatever. During the negotiations, an iron rule is that only one person, the chief negotiator, talks at a time. The reason is that you don't want to reveal any internal disagreements among your team to the other side, as that will give them an opening to exploit. I love to use movie analogies, so you may recall that in the movie The Godfather, Sonny Corleone contradicts his father during a meeting with the five families. This tells the other families that Sonny is willing to do a deal if they can remove Don Corleone, whom they then try to murder. Clearly, Sonny should have kept his mouth shut. You could teach a whole class on negotiation by just watching the Godfather movies.
I followed up with Mitchell by saying that it had struck me when reading about the negotiation process with terrorists or those on a geopolitical or national security level that they take a long time. In fact, he's talked about the importance of patience and endurance. In the commercial field, we often don't have the benefit of time. So I asked if this weakened the arguments for using negotiation and mediation in the restructuring and insolvency world.
It's true that negotiations on national security can take months and even years to conclude, but that's often because there's no real deadline that forces the party to agree sooner. In the commercial field, it's easier to construct artificial deadlines or have real ones for a set of negotiations. For example, so the party themselves can decide ahead of time to give themselves 1, 3, or 6 months to get a deal done. Or there may be financial pressures on one or both parties to conclude a deal by a certain date, or a receiver or court may impose a deadline. Whatever the circumstances, I think a negotiated agreement is always less expensive and time-consuming than litigation. Even in commercial disputes, however, I would argue that the fundamentals of negotiating remain the same.
I then asked Mitchell if, in his experience, it is always worth negotiating or whether there are circumstances where it simply doesn't make sense.
I believe it is always worth negotiating, and let me explain why. While the main goal of a negotiation is to reach a favorable outcome, negotiations can have other benefits. They're a way to acquire information about a competitor that would otherwise be unavailable, about their operations, their preferences, their personnel, their internal organization, even personal rivalries, hopes, and fears. This is true with negotiations between states, but it can also be true between companies. And in the case of negotiating with terrorists or foreign governments, there's always the possibility of using the negotiations to recruit someone over to your side.
My penultimate question was to ask Mitchell for his top tips for an effective negotiation.
Let me offer a few thoughts. First, negotiation and mediation are very different. Negotiation is an adversarial process where you're exploring whether it's possible to find enough common ground to memorialize a basis for future cooperation. Each side cares greatly about the outcome. Mediation is a collaborative process where a neutral third party helps the parties reach an agreement. The mediator is indifferent to the outcome as long as the other parties are satisfied. Second, both negotiations and mediations require a mastery of the brief, high EQ, emotional intelligence, and the creativity to play around with the different variables. Now, here are just a few of the top lessons that I've been able to take from my experience. First, you need to spend sufficient time game planning your tactics and strategy for the negotiation before you start. This will dictate your entire approach. What do you have to have at the end of these negotiations? What would be nice to have? What are you willing to concede? What are you unwilling to concede? Are there any deal breakers? What would cause you to walk away from the negotiating table? As part of your planning, you also need to propose issues that will appear very important to your side, but really aren't. These artificial issues are the ones that you can offer as concessions or compromises to trade during the negotiations. A second lesson is that you have to translate any vague, ambiguous, or intangible concepts into tangible items that can actually be delivered. Here's an example. I spent a good deal of time negotiating with Ian Paisley in Northern Ireland. Understandably, he wanted the IRA to go away. But what does go away really mean? How would we know? His answer was always, the dogs in the street will know. Well, that's pretty unhelpful, as you can imagine. So the challenge for me was to translate that intangible sentiment into something tangible that we could see, touch, and measure. I proposed a set of metrics that could be independently verified. No more recruiting by the IRA, no more criminality, and public statements of support for policing and justice in Northern Ireland. Paisley agreed that if I could get this from Sinn Féin and the IRA, we would have a deal. I then presented Sinn Féin and the IRA with these tangible goals and told them that if they could deliver these, we were done. They did, and we were. A third lesson is that the end game is the most dangerous time in any negotiation, what I call the last 5 minutes. Why is it so dangerous? Well, usually you're exhausted trying to get a deal done by the deadline, and it's much easier for you to make mistakes when you're tired. Also, your opponent may try to relitigate issues that have long been settled. That's a classic ploy. You can't fall for it. And usually, the most challenging issues have been left for the end of the negotiation. You've kicked the can down the road, now requiring both parties to make tough compromises on very sensitive issues that have been postponed. Now, the risk here is not that you will offer a compromise. Compromise may be desirable depending on what you get in return and if it's necessary to get the deal done. The risk is thinking that if you make one or two final compromises, that this will end the negotiation. But after pocketing these compromises, your counterpart may ask for more. The way to prevent this is to ask conditionally ahead of time that if you make a final concession, will it really be final? Will the negotiation be over? If I give you this, are we done? This forces the other side to reveal any lingering issues they want to raise that have been holding back up to that point.
Finally, I asked what impact Mitchell thought current global events would have on the restructuring, turnaround, and insolvency business.
I believe that global events now present an unprecedented opportunity for you and your colleagues in the workout and turnaround business. Many firms will be unable to adapt quickly, many will founder, and some will fail. This means that you and your colleagues have both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is to help these companies navigate this perilous time before they get in trouble, before they're insolvent. The challenge is to persuade them to listen to you now. They may believe that they can handle the coming turbulence themselves. But Simon, as you know, the earlier these companies involve you, the better their chances of not only surviving the next few years, but also thriving well into the future.